Memorial Day Edition: How the American Empire Operates, Part 1. The crimes of the United States have been systematic, constant, vicious, and remorseless, but very few people have actually talked about them. You have to hand it to America. It has exercised a quite clinical manipulation of power worldwide, while masquerading as a force for universal good. It's a brilliant, even witty, highly successful act of hypnosis. Welcome to Geopolitics Demystified, where we bring in perspectives you do not see or hear in the mainstream media. I'm your host, S.L. Canthan. The quote you just heard is from the British writer and Nobel Prize winner Harold Pinter. May 27th of this year is the Memorial Day, which dates back to 1860s and commemorates those who died while serving in the U.S. military. While we can respect the honor of the soldiers who were willing to sacrifice their lives for their country, we can also critically analyze the leaders who make the decisions to go to wars. Thus, today's topic for our podcast is a taboo not only in the U.S. mainstream media, but also across much of the world. And that topic is American imperialism. We will discuss the American empire, how it operates, how it hides in plain sight, wages hybrid and kinetic wars, and uses clever propaganda to justify its endless wars. This should be understood by everyone, including Americans, who are unaware of the cost of the empire as well as the massive deception. Most Americans and even people around the world do not think of America as an empire, even though the US has 800 military bases in 140 countries. That's the power of propaganda. Not surprisingly, Americans do not understand that the American empire is coming to an end and what that means to US economy. Yes, the US needs a new paradigm to survive in a multipolar world. First, let's go back in history a bit. Warnings from the past. On January 17, 1961, 3 days before JFK's inauguration, US President Eisenhower gave his farewell speech from the White House. It was really a shocking speech with a grave warning about the threat to America's democracy. He described the threat with a new term, military-industrial complex, a formidable union of defense contractors and the military. Here's the famous line from that speech. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. Remember that Eisenhower was a retired 5-star Army general, the man who led the Allies on D-Day. On another occasion, he bemoaned, "The jet plane that roars overhead costs $750,000. That's more than a man will make in his lifetime. What world can afford this kind of thing for long?" However, nobody cared about Eisenhower's farewell speech. Instead, they were excited about the new young president, JFK. Ironically, the military-industrial complex hated John F. Kennedy and was likely behind his assassination. JFK wanted to make peace with the USSR and was against the invasion of Cuba as well as escalation of war in Vietnam. In his famous peace speech, JFK said, "What kind of peace do we seek? Not a Pax Americana enforced on the world by American weapons of war, not the peace of the grave or the security of the slave. But peace is bad business for the defense contractors, who make enormous profits from wars, deployment of troops, and maintenance of military bases overseas. As George Orwell said, war against a foreign country only happens when the moneyed classes think they're going to profit from it." Imperialism is also extremely profitable for regular American corporations, which can monopolize markets all over the world. When the US had a robust manufacturing sector, imperialism provided cheap raw materials. Western banks and Wall Street firms also get to trap developing nations with debt and demand flesh, figuratively speaking. How the military operates to enrich corporations was best explained in the 1930s by Smedley Butler, one of the most decorated generals. In his famous testimony before U.S. Congress, as well as in a short book, General Butler spilled out the naked truth. Here's what the whistleblower said and wrote. War is a racket. It is conducted for the benefit of the very few at the expense of the very many. Out of war, a few people make huge fortunes. For example, during World War I, at least 21,000 new millionaires and billionaires were made in the United States. Take one of our little steel companies, Bethlehem Steel, that patriotically set aside the making of rails and bridges to manufacture war materials. Their profit went up 8-fold. How about our friends DuPont? Their annual profits soared 10-fold during the war. International Nickel Company, and you can't have a war without nickel, showed an increase in annual profits from 4 million to 73 million. Not bad. An increase of 1,700%. And let us not forget the bankers who financed the Great War. If anyone had the cream of the profits, it was the bankers. In the World War, we used propaganda to make the boys accept conscription. They were made to feel ashamed if they didn't join the army. Beautiful ideals were painted for our boys who were sent out to die. This was the war to end all wars. This was the war to make the world safe for democracy. No one mentioned to them as they marched away that their going and their dying would mean huge war profits. Woodrow Wilson was re-elected president in 1916 on a platform that he had kept us out of war and on the implied promise that he would keep us out of war. Yet, 5 months later, he asked Congress to declare war on Germany. General Smedley Butler's best summary of war as a racket is the following confession. I spent 33 years in active military service, and during that period, I spent most of my time as a high-class muscle man for big business, Wall Street, and the bankers. In short, I was a racketeer, a gangster for capitalism. I helped Mexico and especially Tampico save for American oil interests in 1914. I helped to make Haiti and Cuba a decent place for the National City Bank boys to collect revenues in. I helped in the raping of half a dozen Central American republics for the benefit of Wall Street. I helped purify Nicaragua for the International Banking House of Brown Brothers in 1902 to 1912. I brought light to the Dominican Republic for the American sugar interests in 1916. I helped to make Honduras right for the American fruit companies in 1903. In China in 1927, I helped see to it that Standard Oil went on its way unmolested. Looking back on it, I might have given Al Capone a few hints. The best he could do was to operate his racket in 3 districts. I operated on 3 continents. By the way, nothing has changed since then. Now the US government spends $1 trillion a year on military, euphemistically called defense. By the way, the US had a Department of War from 1789 until the end of World War II, after which the US got sophisticated in propaganda and thus renamed it to Department of Defense. Most of the money goes to traditional military corporations like Raytheon and Lockheed Martin, but also to service companies, all of which engage in price gouging. For example, shoulder-powered missiles used to cost only $25,000 in 1991 when there was a lot of competition. Now, Raytheon is the sole provider and thus charges $400,000 apiece, a price increase of 16-fold. The biggest profit margins are often for the simple things. For example, $1,300 for a coffee cup, $7,000 for a coffee maker, $14,000 for a toilet seat, and $90,000 for a small bag of plastic bushings. Of course, big items like the F-35 fighter jets cost hundreds of billions of dollars more than promised, while also years behind on schedule. Worse, a majority of the F-35 are not even ready to operate at any given time. There is also corruption at all levels. In Afghanistan and Iraq, many U.S. military personnel and soldiers were involved in blatant bribes, kickbacks, theft, and contract rigging. Billions of dollars were lost due to waste, fraud, and abuse. Many Afghans and Iraqis also became so-called 9/11 millionaires. One Afghan, Hikmat Shadman, was a contractor for the U.S. military, and he made a whopping $160 million as the owner of a trucking company. This is a country where the average person makes $1 a day. Of course, Hikmat funneled some of that money back to American soldiers and contractors. The Pentagon refused to get audited for a long time and finally agreed to it in 2018. Since then, it has failed the audit every single year. It allegedly has assets of nearly $4 trillion spread across 4,500 sites around the world. One last note on this topic. On September 10, 2001, U.S. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld announced that the Pentagon could not track $2.3 trillion of spending. Fortunately for him, everyone forgot about it the next day. How to justify endless wars? As former U.S. President Jimmy Carter said, the U.S. is the most warlike in the history of the world. In its entire history, starting in 1776, the U.S. has been at complete peace only for 16 years. After the failures in Korean War and Vietnam War, the U.S. was humbled and stayed out of major wars for a while. Instead, it focused on proxy wars against the Soviet Union using the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. However, all that changed in 2001 when the U.S. started the so-called War on Terror, which displaced nearly 40 million people in 24 countries, which include Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Yemen, Somalia, etc. And now the proxy war against Russia in Ukraine has added more to those statistics. So how come Americans keep supporting these wars? And why is not the USA broadly condemned as the warmonger all around the world? Answer: amazing propaganda. The excuses for imperialism and colonialism have varied over the years, decades, and centuries. Sometimes Europeans used the spreading of Christianity as an excuse for conquest. Then it was about spreading civilization. Here, Native Americans and Africans were portrayed as savages who had to be civilized or destroyed. When the US wanted to become a great empire like the Europeans, it started with conquering and brutally occupying the Philippines in 1899. At that time, the propaganda was that it was white man's burden to spread civilization. To garner public support for colonization, the U.S. military even brought Filipinos to New York City and put them in a human zoo. And they even tied up children, sometimes as young as 5 years old, to tree trunks to dehumanize them. Slowly, the war propaganda became less barbaric. During World War I, US elites, thanks to people like Edward Bernays, the father of propaganda, described the war as something that would not only end all wars, but also make the world safe for democracy. The public relations success of this phrase led to its adoption by everyone from there on. During World War II, President Roosevelt used the phrase arsenal of democracy to describe the military support that the US provided to the Allies. During the Cold War, freedom and democracy were easy and compelling arguments against the USSR and its allies. Every time a developing nation refused to fully comply with the demands of US banks and corporations, it was labeled communist, which was enough to justify wars, assassinations, and coups. Throughout Latin America, for example, numerous democratically elected leaders were overthrown simply because they proposed progressive reforms such as mandatory education for children or raising the minimum wage, which would affect the profits of American corporations. In Indonesia, the US supported and installed a brutal military dictator, Suharto, who gave away precious natural resources to Western corporations. He literally sat around a table full of Western CEOs and gave away pieces of Indonesia. You get oil, you get copper mines, you get aluminum, you get gold, you get timber, you get rubber, and so on. Similarly, in South Korea, Taiwan, and the Middle East, the US supported dictators, but they were capitalist and pro-US dictators, so it was all good. Over the years, words like dictator and authoritarian have become trigger words that induce Pavlovian response in Americans. Thus, for example, they are used to demonize Putin, Assad, and Xi Jinping. Also, anyone who refuses to bow to the US empire is called a Hitler. George Orwell talked about the psychological manipulation. He said, every war is represented not as a war, but as an act of self-defense against a homicidal maniac. However, here is something that most Americans don't know. The US supports 70% of dictators in the world. Imagine that. Take Jordan, which has a border with Syria. The country of Jordan is ruled by King Abdullah, who has been there since 1999. And his father ruled Jordan for 47 years before that. But the US never calls them dictators or never tries to overthrow their regimes. Why? These good dictators are very compliant and obedient. Sometimes the dictators turn from good to bad when their values decrease. In the 1980s, Saddam Hussein was a great friend of the US. He fought Iran, who used to be a great ally of the US during the rule of Shah, who was another dictator. During the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, the US supplied weapons and advisors to Saddam. He had chemical weapons supplied by Germany and, wait for it, the US. American advisors would provide Saddam's military the satellite images and coordinates of Iranian military so that Iraq could use chemical weapons. Of course, a decade later, those same Western chemical weapons were used to demonize Saddam. All of this is possible because the US media ignores such hypocrisy. Thanks to the CIA's infiltration and the corporate nature of the media, inconvenient truths are buried. Thus, the average American thinks that the US spreads freedom and democracy. And the average American accepts the narrative that the US wages wars to overthrow dictators. The US foreign policy is like a Disney narrative. If you point out how the US supports a certain dictator, the clever answer will often be, well, we cannot be the policeman of the world. We cannot overthrow every single dictator. Conclusion. This is part 1 of this important and complex topic. We will continue on part 2 next week. So please like and subscribe to us on YouTube and Spotify. Follow me, SL Canthan, on Twitter/X. The user handle is @Canthan2030. Thank you.